Welcome to the CADWOLF tutorial on Workspaces. This video covers the basic functionality of Workspaces, including the user interface, how to add new items, rename them, move them, and delete them, as well as permissions and checking documents in and out. Let's get started. Workspaces are web pages that mimic the functionality of a folder. In fact, we will often use the phrase folders in place of the phrase workspaces throughout this and other tutorials. Workspaces are where users add and delete items, as well as store and find documents, datasets, and part trees. All workspaces have the phrase workspaces at the beginning of their URL. Let's look at how workspaces determine the URL of an item. Whenever a user account is created, a workspace is also created with the address of workspaces/username. The URL of any item in this workspace begins with the type of item, followed by the workspace name, and then the name of the item. It is this first section of the URL that lets the platform know whether the item being opened is a workspace, document, dataset, or part tree. When new workspaces are added to the current one, that same level is added to the URL of the item, as you see here. Let's jump into an example and get you more familiar with what you will see when you navigate to a workspace. You're looking at the documentation workspace for CADWOLF. The vertical bar at the left of the screen contains three sections of information. The first is the CADWOLF logo, and the second is the current user information. This information is present on every CADWOLF page. The third section are the views that are currently available. There are two possible views for a workspace. The first is a list of files and folders, and the second is the permissions. We'll talk about both of these in a minute. Let's look at the actual content of the page. First, you can see that the URL is workspaces/documentation. The documentation workspace is one of the few workspaces that isn't directly tied to a user account. Next, you can see the title for the workspace. This title appears at the top of the page as well as the title of the web page itself. Beneath that is the information for the workspace, which is simply text to describe to users what the workspace may contain. Slightly beneath that is an option box where the user can select the order that the items will appear in. On that same level, there is an icon to navigate to the folder above the current one. Clicking on the select box, you can see that there are four views that the user can select. These four options are the date the items are created, the date the item was last saved, the type of the item, and the user rank. Selecting the type option will order the items by their type: folders, files, datasets, and part trees. Choosing one of the date options will order the items in that workspace according to that date. The user rank is the order in which the owner of the workspace wants those items to appear. This is useful in cases like the documentation workspace, where we want the files to appear in a given order. The main section of the page shows the content of the workspace. Each line represents a different item, either a document, workspace, dataset, or part tree. The icon on the left indicates the item type. Clicking on the icon will take the user to the item in question. The icon for a document is a file, the icon for a workspace is a folder, the icon for a dataset is a sprocket, and the icon for a part tree is a list. Going across each row, you can see the name of the item, the icon for the info, and then the dates that the item was created and last saved. Clicking on the info icon will display the info for that item. The info for workspace is the same information that you see at the top of each workspace. The info for the other items are set within those items. Scrolling down the page, we see a workspace titled Examples. Clicking on that icon takes us to that workspace. You can see the URL is now documentation/examples. In this way, the examples workspace is really just a subfolder of the documentation workspace. You can also see a dataset and a part tree in the list of files for this workspace. Clicking again on the workspace titled Statics and Dynamics, you can see that we are taken to another subfolder with the URL changed accordingly. We then use the up arrow to go up one level in the folder structure. That's it for this view. Let's take a look at what a workspace looks like when you have permission to edit it. We've now logged on and are viewing the documentation workspace through the eyes of a user that has permission to edit it. Looking at the left bar, you can see that a user is logged on and that a second view is now available. We'll talk more about this view later. Moving from left to right, we see a menu bar that comes into focus when the mouse is placed over it. There are 5 options, and clicking on any of those options will add that item to the current workspace. Notice that we actually use the term folder here in place of workspace. In addition to adding a file, folder, dataset, or part tree, the user can also add an image. We'll discuss that more later as well. Note that the title and description of the workspace is the same as before. However, since we have permission to edit this workspace, we can simply click on the title, change the text, and then hit enter to save the new title. Clicking on the information brings up an edit bar at the top of the screen and a save button for when you're finished editing. Looking at the main column, there are 5 new items added to each row. These items let the user copy, move, and delete the item, as well as check a document in or out. We're going to show how each of these actions work in just a moment. The final item is a drop box that lets the user select the order that each item will appear in. This is the user rank that we discussed earlier. Before we go any further, let's talk about how images are added to the workspace. Images are handled differently from other items in CADWOLF. Obviously, they are used in files, but unlike everything else in those files, they are uploaded to a workspace and then pulled into one or more documents. There are several advantages to handling images this way. The first advantage is that you don't have to re-upload the image each time you need to use it, and thus you remove any confusion about using the same image repeatedly. Second, if you want to replace an image later, you only need to replace the image in the workspace, and it is uploaded in all documents that it is used in. Finally, storing images on CADWOLF is easier for storing and using them in documents. This way, you don't have to maintain a separate folder of images on your computer. Let's run through a quick example to see what it looks like to upload an image to your workspace. Back in our demo workspace, we click on the icon to add an image. You'll notice that a button appears, and clicking on it lets us navigate to whatever file we choose. The file is then uploaded and placed into the workspace. Reloading the workspace lets us view the image by clicking on the info icon. There is a separate tutorial on images that shows the user everything they need to know about placing them into documents. Let's talk for a few minutes about permissions, and then we'll look at a demonstration of adding other items to our workspace. There are 4 types of permissions that a user can have. The first is view permission. This simply means that you have permission to view the item in question. You cannot alter the item in any fashion. When we first looked at the documentation workspace, we only had view permission. The second type is use permission. This permission applies only to documents. If a user has permission to use a document, it means that they can interact with certain equations, but they cannot save any changes. The third type is edit permission. If a user has permission to edit an item, it means that they can change it and save any changes. Permission to edit a workspace means that you can add, delete, move, and copy items within that workspace. Permission to edit a document or dataset means that a user can make any and all changes and save those changes. Finally, a user can have admin permissions. Admin permissions give the user the ability to change the permissions of other users, including adding and removing names from the list of users approved to edit and view items. Note that granting a user use permission obviously grants them permission to view an item. Granting them edit permission also grants them permission to use and view the item as well. There are 3 groups of people that users can assign permissions to. The first is everyone. In other words, you can set a file or folder so that every user, whether logged on or not, can view an item. You cannot give edit permissions to everyone, as this would mean that every user could alter your files. The second category is a select group of users. This means that you have a list of CADWOLF usernames that can edit, use, or view a file. Users must be logged on as one of those users to perform that action. Finally, you don't have to give permissions to anyone. This is done by simply changing the permissions to a list of users and then leaving that list blank. For example, the documentation workspace is set so that anyone can view the contents of the workspace and use the files. No one except the creator is given permission to edit the workspaces or the files. These permissions can be changed at any time by someone who has admin permissions. There is another option, which is to set permissions to inherit. Doing this means that the current folder or workspace will have the same permissions as its parent folder. Documents are unique in that in order to alter a document, users must have permission to edit the file and they must have the file checked out. In the workspace, if the user has the document checked out, the user will see a blue check mark under the status for that document. This means that they can edit the file and save the changes. If there is a key icon, then the item is not checked out. The purpose of the checkout system is to ensure that only one user is ever editing a document at any given time. All of this can seem a little daunting to a first-time user. Let's look at an example of creating a file and then checking it out, and it'll clear things up for us. What you're looking at now is the workspace for a theoretical user named the Wolf. You can see that the user is logged on and that there are 2 views available. What we're going to do now is walk through the process of adding new items and then moving and deleting them. First, we click on the icon to add a new folder or workspace. You can see that the new folder is added at the bottom of the workspace with a random number attached to it as part of the name. Double-clicking on the name lets us edit it. We enter the new name and hit enter to save our changes. Then we click on the folder icon to go to that workspace. Notice that the URL indicates that we are in this new folder. Every new workspace will have this default title and description and will obviously have no contents yet. We click on the title and are able to enter any desired text and then hit return to save the changes. We then click on the description in our text and save the changes. Now let's add a file to the workspace. Clicking on the icon to add a document, we see that a new line is added to the workspace with the default name. Also note that although we have permissions to edit this file, we cannot yet change the name as we have not checked it out. We then click on the status key icon to check out the file. Once this is done, we can click on the title and change it. We can then open the file by clicking on the file icon. This same process can be used to add and then change the name of any file, folder, dataset, or part tree. The only difference is that documents have to be checked out to change the name. Remember that all names are part of the item URL, so there are strict naming conventions. You are essentially limited to letters, numbers, spaces, and dashes. Now we click on the file icon to open the file. Notice that the URL we are taken to maintains the same folder structure with two changes. First, the name of the file is now appended to the end. Second, the phrase Workspaces has been replaced with Documents. Looking at the properties of the file, we see that the user in question has the file checked out. If this was not the case and the user has edit permissions and no one else has checked the file out, then there would have been an option to check it out. Moving back to the workspace, we click the icon to move the file. An input box appears and we enter the URL for the workspace one level up from this folder. Hitting enter moves the file to this location. Note that you must have permission to edit both this workspace and the workspace that you are moving the file to. Going up one level to that folder that we just moved the file to, we can see that the file is now there. Opening it, we can see that the URL of the document has also changed. Going back to the workspace, we delete both the file and the folder that we created. You are asked if you are sure before the delete is carried out because the delete action is not reversible. Now let's talk a little bit more about exactly what permissions do, and then let's look at how CADWOLF lets you edit those permissions. Every item in CADWOLF has unique permissions settings. This image illustrates a possible set of permissions for a user. This user has full permissions on the parent folder, and then mixed permissions on several items within that folder. This is done this way in CADWOLF because it is often useful to organize work in a folder hierarchy that makes sense and then assign work in given folders to given users. In most cases, a user cannot have full permissions without having full permissions to every parent folder. This is not the case in CADWOLF. So what exactly does each permission give to the user? Obviously, for any item, view permissions lets the user see the item. Permissions to edit a workspace means that you can add items to the workspace and delete any items that you also have permissions to edit. You cannot delete files or other items in that workspace that you do not have permission to edit. Admin permissions lets you change permissions of other users. For a document, use permissions means that you can alter some equations, but you cannot save those changes. Edit permissions means that you can add or remove content to the document as well as change that content. Admin permissions means that you can alter the permissions of other users for that item. For a dataset or part tree, the same statements apply. Let's look at how users can change permissions in CADWOLF. Going back to our example workspace, we click on the second view, which is labeled Permissions. Note that for each item in the workspace, there are 4 permissions: Admin, Edit, Use, and View. If you had admin permissions for any of these items, then you can click on the type of permissions that you want to change and select from the available list. If a permission is set to a selected group of users, then you can click on the icon next to the permission and view the list of users with those permissions. New users can be given permission by simply entering their name in the provided space and hitting enter. Users are removed from the list of approved users by clicking on the delete icon next to the name of that user. Here you see that when someone has been granted edit permission, they are also granted the lesser permissions. Well, that's it for this tutorial on Workspaces. If you want to keep up with everything that's going on with the system, follow us on Facebook or Twitter. If you have any questions or you'd like to see a specific function added, let us know on the website.